This is 4.4 Dermis and Hypodermis notes. As the essential question is, what structures are located in the dermis and hypodermis layers and what are their functions? The dermis is the second or the deeper layer of the skin. It is made up of connective tissue. The function of the dermis is to support the avascular epidermis. Recall that the epidermis lacks blood supply, and so the vascularized dermis that has the blood supply keeps the epidermis nourished. And it also regulates body temperature. The dermis contains the three fibers, the collagen, elastic, and reticular fibers, and it contains fibroblasts, which makes the actual, the three different types of fibers. They contain blood supply, as I mentioned. They have sweat and oil glands, and they have nerve endings for sense of touch, pressure, heat, and cold, and also pain. They contain erector pili muscle, which is involved in raising the hair. They have adipocytes, which are your fat cells, and they contain hair follicle. The dermis also have two layers. The more superficial or the top layer is called the papillary layer. The word papilla means finger-like projections. They provide support for the epidermis, and the papillary consists about 20% of the dermis layer, and it is made up of the areolar connective tissue. The top portion of the papillary layer is called the dermal papillae, and it is the connection between the epidermis and the dermis. And the dermal papillae has the main function is that it allows the epidermis and the dermis to have a tight fitting, so that they are anchored tightly together, so that there is no separation between the epidermis and the dermis. Also, because of this ridging and the finger-like projections on the dermal papillae, that's what creates fingerprints. Other structures found in the papillary layer is the free nerve endings for pain and temperature, and another type of nerve endings found in the papillary layer is the Meissner corpuscle. The Meissner corpuscle is for sensing the light touch sensation, and you find Meissner corpuscles in the fingers and toes, which requires a lot more sensitivity to touch. Here's a general structure of the skin. You note the two layers of the skin, the epidermis, which is the top layer. Then you see the dermis, which is the thicker, deeper layer. And within the dermis, you have the papillary layer, which is the superficial layer. And then you have the deeper layer of the dermis, which is called the reticular layer. Whereas the superficial papillary layer provides support for the epidermis, the reticular layer, it provides strength to the skin because it is made up of dense connective tissue. Dense connective tissue, remember, is the one that is really tough and holds its strength and its shape. Reticular layer contains sebaceous gland, which are your oil glands, hair follicle, ducts of the sudoriferous gland, which is one of the sweat glands. Another type of nerve ending found in the reticular layer is the Pacinian corpuscles, which is for sensing deep pressure and vibration. And you can tell them apart from other nerve endings because it looks like a sliced onion, and you can see it on the picture on the right. The 5 nerve endings that you really need to know, and like 3 of them are pictured here, is the free nerve endings, which you have for here, which is for pain, but you could also have one for temperature, which is for cold and hot. And then you have the Meissner corpuscles. Again, Meissner corpuscle is going to be closer to the surface in the papillary layer. And then the Pacinian corpuscle is going to be more in the reticular layer, and it's the one that's in the deeper layer, and it looks like a onion. The last layer and the deepest layer is called the hypodermis, also called the subcutaneous layer, but it is not part of the skin. Okay, so there's only 2 layers of skin. Hypodermis is an additional layer that anchors the skin to the underlying tissue, and it is made up of areolar and adipose connective tissue. And the job of the hypodermis is because it contains adipose tissue, it provides insulation, keeps the body warm, and depending on the location, it's going to vary in the amount of adipose tissue there are. And that could also vary in gender, whether you're a men or women, or your lifestyle, your genes, and all that. One of the things you're going to have to know is the structures within each layer of the skin. So epidermis, which is the more superficial layer, and it's much thinner. They contain 3 structures that you need to know. One is called the hair shaft, which is the portion of the hair that's above the skin. Another structure is called the sweat pore, which is the opening where the sweat actually comes out of the skin. And the last structure is sweat duct, which is a tube that leads from the sweat gland to the sweat pore. And that tube is where the sweat comes out of the skin. So those are the 3 structures that are found in the epidermis. Remember that dermis is separated into 2 layers, which is the papillary layer, which is the much thinner layer. Structure located in the papillary layer is the dermal papillae, which creates the ridges here, which is makes up the fingerprint. And notice that's what keeps the epidermis and the dermis layer packed tightly close together, so there's no slippage going on. There is the Meissner corpuscles, the free nerve endings for pain, temperature, cold and hot. And you could also have the sweat duct because it still has to go through the papillary layer to get to the surface of the skin. In the much thicker reticular layer, like this, reticular layer, structures you will see is the structures as like the spacious oil gland, the erector pili muscle, the sensory nerve fibers, not the nerve ending but the fibers, the sweat glands, the Pacinian corpuscles, the arteries in the red, the vein in the blue. Then you see the hair root, which is the portion of the hair that's underneath the skin, and the hair follicle is the structure surrounding the hair root. And then the hair follicle receptors, which are the nerve fibers directly associated with the hair. Lastly, again, hypodermis is not part of the skin, but their main structure that they have is the adipose tissue. They could also contain sensory nerve fibers because they originate from beneath the skin, so those are the 2 structures in the hypodermis. The 4.4 notes homework is, what is the purpose of dermal papillae? Number 2, distinguish between the different types of nerve endings. 3, what structures are located in the papillary and reticular layers of this dermis?